Hello, people. This week I read Bismarck, The Story of a Fighter. I think that's the, what do we call that, a subtitle? I think that's right. By Emil Ludwig. This is a biography of Otto von Bismarck, the man who is sort of credited with unifying the German states into the country of Germany. And he's sort of in charge just before, World War I and II, which is a separate situation. Our author, I believe, didn't meet Bismarck, but was of the time ish. So, what do we say? I think Bismarck was born. The day Bismarck was born, Napoleon was coming back from Elba, the island of Elba. Just so you get a gauge in where your mind, in your mind of where this person started, and then where he sort of ends up. He ends up, again, at 80, 89 or something when he dies, and then 2 steps later, there's World War II. So, I mean, it compacts pretty quickly when you look at biographies. It's very cool. So our author wrote this, and it was published in between. So I believe World War I had happened, and World War II hadn't happened yet for maybe 20 more years in between, something 10, 20, something like this. In any case, I bring it up because there is clearly a certain amount of aggrandizing that's done in this book. It is history. I think the person had access to a lot of Bismarck's personal letters. So he gives us access and a perspective on a person that we haven't met through this. This is how you take it. What do we do? Back in ye olden times, they would send an ambassador to the court of Peter the Great. And part of what that ambassador would come back and he'd say, he looks like this. Big, tall, strapping man, healthy, clear-eyed, straight nose, right? The features and his presence and his health and how he moved and talked, if he stammered or didn't stammer, if he had a limp or no limp, And it was a very individualized, personal opinion of that person. Now, he's a professional ambassador, so he does a good job. He's not just, grabbing things out of thin air. Most of the time, history is full of issues that come from this. But this book is, in a sense, that. In a sense, a very personal impression that the author is trying to get across to you, the reader. And again, I mentioned that in between world wars, because there was a mentality in Germany at that time of, reorientating yourself in the world. How did we lose? What happened? Is our value system? Clearly we know, they ended up choosing that it's all the Jews' fault. And that's what went on with there. But in this pocket, you can sort of see it. You can see that. You can see, again, when you get a book from a historian, some are just facts and some are like this, wherein he, expands on moments in his mind and then writes that down. The conversation probably went this way. He wasn't in the room. He doesn't know. And people in the room aren't saying. So it's just sort of an imagining in what this person, how he thought this person was. It's not a one-to-one, this is the thing that was said in this meeting. We have this vague line that happens in this book. But I think it's still considered history. And these are also important to read because, as a person, if you want to get the most out of history, you have to grab multiple points of view on the same subject. And some of those are more opinionated and some will be less opinionated. And, you get 5 or 7. And you can come up between all of them with your own idea on who this person was. And I bet it'd be more I think it'd be more accurate than you realize, even with these disconnected sources. Disconnected from the origin, I would say. The best would be, right, I was related to him and we grew up together. I mean, it's hard, parents maybe, but it's hard to get better than that on knowing a person. Then next would be, I met Bismarck. And then we go on from there. But how the general mass of people come to understand is this way. And on some of the older histories, your Greeks, your Romans, your Josephuses, it becomes history telling you history. The further away we get from these things. And if you can't come to grips with some amount of opinion, you lose a lot in some facts that they had. Because the Romans, 2,000 years ago, were much closer to the ancient Greeks than I am. But it's still a Roman senator, and we start to have this sort of piece apart that we have to do to get to the nougats that we want as readers. So we start with Bismarck. A lot of stuff happened in this man's life that we just sort of waltz over with this book. We don't get too deep into his lineage, other than the Bismarcks have been in sort of Pomerania area. What did they say? Since time immemorial. Way back. I think Bismarck, liked to boast that his family was in Germany longer than the Hohenzollerns, who were the kings of Prussia. Just a little jab. They were all knights. They were all in charge. He was very much in charge. Schönhausen, I think this is the house. He was basically lord of this estate town area. Very much bigwig. Very much had servants. He was not a bad person in like sort of a tyrannical way. But he was clear about the delineation. Our author doesn't make a big point of it, but you can pick up on the fact that, one time he plowed into someone because the aristocrat's supposed to walk on the highest point of the road, curved road. The crap flows down. Poor walk down there. I'll walk up here. Dude didn't move. Plow into him. Just as an example of how locked to the way things should be he was. This is how it is. This is how it should be. And of course this comes into more of an effect when he's in charge and people want democracy. How dare you? But this area was very much outside. He grew up outside. He liked nature. He liked dogs. He liked horses. His parents were very, very German. I think at one point he fell off a horse. And his mom said, your dad said the horse couldn't have knocked you off. It's not the horse's fault. It's probably your fault because you have a terrible saddle. And we're talking like an 8-year-old. They're very German in that sense. He's very existential. He has a lot of thoughts. You go to church. His parents weren't religious, but he had thoughts about it. It's either God is omnipotent, in case I, being Bismarck, I have no say in what's going on, or I'd be arrogant to believe that I can pray and affect such a powerful being. So either I'm arrogant or he's omnipotent. In any case, he didn't see a spot where he fit much with God or religion. Which in those days was a kind of an out there, I guess, more thought. It was more liberal than conservative, if we have to make the analogy. He, like Winston Churchill, very much didn't like school. His was a very harsh, militaristic Prussian school. You get woken up. They're old soldiers, so you get woken up by like a rapier point, and you get, sort of hit when you do half a thing wrong. This kind of sort of rough treatment of children, if I'm being 100% honest, but that's what they did. But it wasn't the treatment he didn't like. It was the lack of freedom. He really, even at a young age, he never really wanted to be told what to do. And so he had a bit of a problem in that he grew up to be kind of a big guy. And big guys go in the military, but he knew he couldn't survive the military because he wasn't going to take orders. I don't like to be told what to do. I don't care if it is the military. So he, went the legalese route. And a lot of his 20s, I would say, is just floating, which is wild to me. You would think a guy who ended up at such a pinnacle of power would be more ambitious. He is basically having zero ambitions. He says, what is it? He says, one day I spent the day riding and walking all day in the sunshine. Life is like a magic lantern show. He's just absolutely bored, doesn't do anything. Everything's nice and easy for him. He becomes a lawyer, but wouldn't even bother sort of delving into how that happened. But our author, again, is not interested in some of the machinations behind the scenes. Our Bismarck then spends about a decade being essentially a Don Juan, just in and out of relationships, very much in love one minute and then very much in love with someone else the next. Not, I would say, a man whore. Meaning it's not just, it's their relationships, and then they break up, and then he finds a new one. He has an honor system. Also, and they learn this, he shows this in school very early on, but in that era, you could easily say a man who doesn't want to join the army is a coward. Coward is being a bad thing to call a dude. But in that era, he would then fight you. He was big and strong and unafraid, just not motivated. Just a very, very interesting mixture of a person. Because they all said that. What did they say? He was courage and elegant. He was courage and arrogance. He was violence and elegance. He because the standard would have been, you can't just shy away from a fight. He wouldn't. But typically the guy who excels in these things takes this route. He didn't do that either. He was a lot of contradictions for these people. He got a friend from America. What is it? Motley? An American? But again, it becomes a lifelong friend, an important relationship, but we don't get much on who this person is. It's very much from the point of view of, the author is interested. He sees that these are friends, and I'm assuming he's reading a lot of letters where these two people are talking, and if you just find a group of people who've been friends a long time, what you find is what they're talking about is not interesting or important. But to them, the importance is the, any interaction with this person that I care about. And so from a historical point of view, you could either fully just give me those letters, which would be useless to everyone because none of this matters anyway, or you can just try and get across that this matters and then move on. It wasn't a type of thing where I went to visit this friend in America and we got in a fight and then I shot a person who ended up being president. No, there's no convergence of major history with this other person. But he is part of history because he's involved in this major person's life. So he can't be left out, but there's not much I guess the author could add that would be interesting in any kind of a way. So I get why he didn't put him in. He gets to around 30-ish, and he has a lady he likes in a friend group, I would say. And then influenza comes, and her mom gets sick and dies, and her brother gets sick, and then she gets sick. So it's a very highly emotional, I would say, time. And in this time, she is sort of in her sickness worried about him, worried to say you need more God in your life. Again, our author is religious, but I think this also happened. And then she dies, so that he's highly affected by, here's a person who cared for me, who I sort of cared for, who was more concerned with me than themselves in this sort of high trying moment. In their last moments, they die, and that their concern was me. He's also amazed at how the family takes it, wherein, because they're very religious, they don't see this as the end or a horrible time, but the soul that moves on to heaven, afterlife. He starts to believe in all these things and sort of prays for the first time. Again, a pivotal moment. And then so I think in this spirit, it sort of awakens in him maybe more of a want, more of a desire to have an effect on the outside world. And so he quickly sort of gets involved in that. Because he's an aristocrat, he ends up at a party, so he ends up meeting the Prince of Prussia. He has friends, and one of them gets him a sort of a minor civil servant job fixing a dike. Again, we don't get any. I would like more intel on how this went, but we don't have it. And part of it's Bismarck's fault too, right? I keep saying that we don't have this information. He was very secretive. That he was always worried I would. He multiple times sent letters and said, destroy this letter when you're done reading it. So he kept things close to the vest, and I guess there's just no way to record some of these things that happen. Oh, I talked to Bismarck about this dike, and then he talked to this other guy, and you need to see the whole to know the actions he's taking, but you can't really get it. But it's interesting to me that he goes from there, and really, from all accounts, is diligently working on this dike, on fixing this dike. He's really committed to the cause here. But at the same time, he's like, I need to get married. And so, from this friend group, he finds a lady, Johanna. And I think there's some tie to, we've been through this tragedy. So there's a thing above, the history of that tie makes the relationship a little bit stronger than a relationship would have been with some outside lady. He doesn't really care about money from a lady. He doesn't need to marry higher up. He wants to marry someone with a solid lineage, someone who is, not a wallflower. He doesn't marry an equal, I would say, but it's himself thinking, I don't have an equal, so I'm not going to find one of those. But he does marry someone who is a solid person, a kind person. Not a wallflower that's just gonna sit around. There's an intelligence to her. They even at some point say, she says that she's a little more wild than he is. And I think they mean in the sense of she's less afraid to sort of challenge social norms, whereas he's very rigid to them. And I think that speaks to her, intelligence, her character. But I also can't help but think of, my boy, where is it? LBJ here. Because he wasn't particularly interested in marriage until he got this ambition to make an effect. So it's early on, and it's he's messing with the dike, and then he's like, I need to get married, and then he does that fairly quickly. Gets the family on his side. He sees what he wants, and then he gets it, and then he moves on. But I get the same sense from LBJ marrying Lady Bird. Some of it's money, but it's mostly, I think, he knows to be higher in politics, he needs to be married. And so he gets himself married. And we see more of these sort of connections. Not connections in the sense they knew each other, anything like that, but connections in the type of person who does this. This being politics. It's a very dirty, nasty business. But that some cats revel in it. What is the tendencies those cats seem to have? He and LBJ seem to share a lot of these. He and Napoleon seem to share a lot of these. He and Alexander the Great. Around 32, he's like, I need to become a member of the Landtag. This is sort of there's a king. There's not exactly a parliament, meaning these are people who are voted on, elected, and can then tell the King of England what to do. We don't have that in this era at this point. But we have people who are given responsibility who the king will listen to, and that's how dikes and roads get fixed. That's how the thing functions. There's functionally government. But it is a power. And he gets in when a Saxon knight gets sick. Same way LBJ got into the Senate. Someone gets sick, and he, goes for the sort of vacant spot. This guy, he starts his maneuvering, gets into the Landtag, and then he's the youngest member there at 32. Very quick. The skill is there. It's just wild to me that he didn't have any motivation until this late in life. Just waltzing around. But once he has the motivation, no one's as good at politics as him. And so they start to lose very quickly. And he starts to rocket himself up. He's at this post for, I want to say like 12 years, something like this. Again, this gets waltzed over. I think he just sits and he learns and he watches and he gets a bead on things. It's a fairly quick education, if I'm being honest. In the 40s, the 1840s, mind you, we have a kind of a revolt, a Prussian uprising, wherein the liberals want more, political reform, job reform, this kind of thing. It got a little heated, got violent. Obviously, they all get shot down. We're not going to have that, so it didn't stick. But in the course of this action, in steps Bismarck. The king sort of runs, because he's kind of a chicken. And Bismarck makes a good show of, being in uniform. He gathers up guys from his local municipality. They ride in, because they were under the assumption the king was captured. They were going to free him. And he makes a big show of being the big guy. Now, mind you, he's riding in where people could shoot at you, but he still makes a show of it so that the king sees, and he sort of sticks in the king's mind. And he sticks in, once you're in the king's mind, you're in other people's minds. And now he sort of uses this to start maneuvering, because he's not going to stay in the land tag forever. I think he's aware, even when he gets into the land tag, of a higher spot. Because again, he doesn't like to be told what to do. Now here's the thing that, again, LBJ does that are Bismarck does as well. They're both very large men, and they both know how to maneuver older men. The older men for Bismarck are obviously the king and what's his name? Leopold von Gerlach, a general. There's one example where the king is like, why don't you come to have dinner with me? And, just quickly, loudly, unafraid, he's like, I can't. My wife's sick. I gotta go. The king not used to this. So the king, and I think this was Bismarck's point, the king sends an aide-de-camp to him and then a royal messenger to put in his service to say, here's this guy who will help you and keep you up to date on the state of your wife, and that messenger will go and come faster than you could. You're not a doctor anyway. So now come have dinner with me. Right? So sort of the pride of the king can't someone say no to him. But he needed this social reason to get him back. But what Bismarck wants is for you to want him. LBJ was the same. He'll help you in any kind of political sense, but he wants you to ask him for the help. And it's a way to lower yourself, even just a little, even in steps. And that puts them on the ascendancy, which is what he wanted. And he gets this from the king. That he goes and has dinner with the king. But he got this out of him. And then for this Gerlich, That guy says in notes, which tells me sort of how he was thinking, that Bismarck's like a son to him, that he takes a lot of pride in having discovered this sort of tiger of politics, that you can clearly see he's skilled, but I found him and I moved him up to this minister level, which is what Bismarck wanted anyway. But behind the scenes, again, here's where one history can help with the other, because I have more information on LBJ. Moment to moment, it happened in a more modern time. And so moment to moment, LBJ, in talking to Speaker of the House, I can't remember his name, it's annoying me, and this other senator from Georgia, the big time senator, he makes a big show of, sometimes he would literally sit at their feet and look up at them. He would say, over and over, you're like a father to me. Over and over, I need you. I need your help. I'm doing this job, but I can't, not for a second, do this without your constant, steadfast wisdom. My God, if I were just half as smart as you, I could just fix more of this than you realize. I need you. He overdoes that, and I think something about, for these guys, older men, to have a big strapping guy, it plays on their mind like, I used to be that, or this has this ability, or I can control it. Whatever that is that swirls in there, they press upon that person, and that person is then inclined to shower them in favors, which is what happened with LBJ in the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it's what happens to Bismarck here with this general. He's the main one who pushes him in and gets him right there next to the king, and then he works the king, and then he locks down his whole setup. It's very, very interesting, the parallels between these two. And again, I'm making some of this up myself, because none of this is in the Bismarck book. But when the two things start to align and there's gaps, if they align this much and there's a gap and then this much, maybe I can say it didn't do this randomly, right? I can say maybe this part helps me fill in that, and the other way around. So there's some parts of Bismarck that can illuminate parts of LBJ in these subtle ways. Think about it. Now, our King Wilhelm, bless his heart, good guy, not a bad guy, but he slowly, what do they say? He goes insane. Slowly starts to get dementia or lose his mind or whatever the case is. And I'm going to be honest, our boy Bismarck uses this. He uses this to essentially wrap himself in all power. And there's some, as he's going, he knows he can convince the king. King, you want the red pen instead of the black one. He's like, yeah, I want the red one. Once the king says it, everyone has to agree. Everyone can see this is what's happening. But what can you do? You have to listen to the king. And then the people who have an issue with it, politics, Bismarck works them over and then gets them to agree or gets them ousted. Probably more agreeable than anything. So that they all start to line up with his vision. His vision quickly becomes German unification. You would think, we all speak German, let's just get along. The things that are opposed to it are obviously the other European powers. Prussia is a very sharp sword. Now, it's a small country. If you gave that sharp sword the backing of millions of more people, of agriculture, maybe the sword gets unstoppable. So a France, a Russia, an England will interject themselves in this to happen. Austria as well. The other thing that goes against you is the nature of the Germans. Back in medieval times, if you had a kingdom and you're German and you die, you split it equally between all of your kids. And then they split it with theirs. And they split it with theirs. So I'm a king of Bavaria. I'm a king of Hamburg. I'm king of this. I'm king of that. I'm like, bro, there's like 75 different kings and princes and royals all over the place. Now, how would you convince a royal king to subjugate himself to some other king? How would you manage that? How do you convince them to do that? This is what he did, somehow. Now, again, I wish the book covered more how. It doesn't in the depth that I want, but that's essentially what he does. He will, in some instances, just overrun them, I guess. In some instances, he props a villain against them. So if I can, Austria is a problem. There are some Germans there, but also a lot of non-Germans. It's the nature of Austria and where it is and how it's been run. And that guy thinks of himself highly. He's not going to just go in here. But we want those Germans. And so I have other groups of Germans who want those Germans. So he somehow makes it so that they're like antagonistic. He says those Germans will infect us more or less, and Austria will want to supplant us. And he uses the fear of that to then sort of start steamrolling people into his setup. At some point we have a war against Austria, which of course Prussia is going to win. It's the sharpest knife. And Austria is a bit goofy. And then through that war he carves out pieces of those German areas. And he just slowly gets them all to agree. He'll play sort of your French against the Russians against the British against either other of them, and always to buy time so that they don't interfere and stop his growth of his country into becoming unified. He starts very much pro-Prussia. Again, when he was young, he didn't care, but now that he's in politics, he puts the von, the official title in his name, Otto von Bismarck. You need to call me that. Prussia's a big deal. He pressures the king with the idea of Prussia. So I can't tell the king what to do. I'm not above the king. But I can chastise the king if he does anything that weakens the honor of Prussia. Because Frederick the Great was a great man, and I can't imagine a world where he will allow laws to subjugate the kingship that he left down to us beneath some Austrian law. He would rather die than see that. He uses one against the other until more of these get in line. And he a lot of times he says he won't get it done in his lifetime, but he easily gets it done in his lifetime. And then we have one of the funniest scenes in all of sort of royalty. So you grab a large group now, and we're going to crown an emperor. This is the way around it. You're not subject to another king. You all collectively make an emperor. Makes sense. Then the other princes are like, well, I can still be prince. My son will still be king of Bohemia or Hamburg or wherever. And we have this great emperor. That seems like a good thing because, Prussia is a sharp knife, and we need that knife to hold off these other horrible people, these dirty French people that want to take our stuff. So we're sitting in a room. And like the king of Prussia doesn't want it. Because like his brother didn't want it or something to this. He's just looking down on being an emperor because he's so rigid with honor that wanting to be emperor is seen as a negative, so he can't want it. So here's Bismarck in a room, and they make a funny point, and this comes up a couple of times, inadvertently, I would say, where here's your room full of princes, and we're trying to make a nation of Germany, and 2 Germans are present who aren't princes, 2 of these citizens who will become part of this great nation of Germany. Only of all of those people, only 2 are just citizens. And they're both Jewish. I'm like, that's just funny to me. The only Germans there when Germany was founded were Jewish Germans. I'm like, that's just funny. As a side note, he was also sort of friendly with Jews. Bismarck himself. He didn't mind hanging out with them. He liked how they got about their business. He thought, if we could just pair every Jew in the Lorraine area of France with a German woman, we'd just make a super group of dudes. I'm like, I don't know why Germans are always talking about superhumans, but Side issue. Eventually, we get him to take the crown, and there it is, the birth of a nation. And so we then make sort of a quasi-constitution wherein we have laws that should matter, but then we have this chancellor, who is Bismarck, of course, who is now not bound. I'm like, because I serve the king, but there's a law of Germany. Which one takes precedent? He would use one against the other whenever he needed to move whatever he needed to along. So when the law's on his side, he's like, bro, you can't do that. It's illegal. Look at the law right here. It says, can't do that in Germany. When they came and said, you can't do this, look at the law. It says you're not allowed. He says, bro, what are you talking about laws? I serve a king ordained by God. I serve the emperor. What are you talking about? What is this law? Get it out of my face. He would do this constantly. So now he has this emperor who's sort of out of his mind in his pocket. And he just, what they say, maintains the peace of Europe for about 20 years. He's just running things. And here's another interesting thing I found, is that outwardly, when he's talking to Russia and England and France and Italy, he's not subservient, but he's very nice. He's very aware. He takes their feelings into account. He cajoles them a lot to get them back on his side or back on the place that he wants them. But internally, he's a tyrant. Internally, he just commands Germans to do a thing, and he's just expecting them to do it. And it's weird that later in his life, towards the end, he realizes that that might have been a mistake. That of all the things he did, if he'd have done the same out internally, then what could have grown in Germany would have been a much stronger government than the one he sort of essentially left them with, that then was damaged after World War I. And he didn't live much past that, but then his vision of the future probably saw what we ended up getting, is your Hitler, a tyrant who could sort of swoop in on this young thing that didn't have enough time to grow, right? So our Congress was around a decent enough time before the Civil War, and it can hold itself up through some turmoil. His didn't. His Reichstag, which is what the new one was called, didn't have enough growth before it was challenged. And then it had this sort of horrible happenings that affected the world. But that's not on him. He can only do so much. And in his defense, there were no world wars when he was running things. He understood the interests of each of the other countries. He understood sort of the Baltics and Russia and their interactions with Austria. He understood, France and England, the antagonism there. And he understood what Germany was. Again, the sharpest sword. That all of these sort of stalemate in their alliances and in their antagonisms. And that any side Germany picked would be tilted in their favor. If he chose to help Austria and Italy, France would lose, England, Russia, etc. He could tip the scales, and he used this to constantly keep them sort of at bay the way he needed. Very intelligent, very smart. No world wars during his life. Now, internally, an interesting thing that, again, parallels in history. He was absolutely against democracy and socialism, which in that era, in the 1880s and 70s and 90s, was growing in all the countries, in France, in England, in Russia. He didn't, because, again, he was born in an area where he says he can look back into the depths of history and see that my family's been here, and I can have generations of my forefathers who lived in the same room. And when they looked out, that guy was gardening and that guy was tending to the cows. For generations, his family's gardened here and his family's tended to the cows. And it's the sort of the mindset of aristocrats that the whole world works this way. This is his world. And that you would say that that farmer and then that shepherd and that gardener want to group up and then tell him how to run this thing. He just can't abide that. He can't imagine a world where these sort of plebes get to have status equal to him, and not equality of, I have a nice house. He wasn't thinking in terms of houses. They probably were, of money and houses and this, but he's thinking in terms of running things. He sees that Winston Churchill thought the same, that the aristocratic class ran the world better than any Congress could, and that the world wars show the proof of this, etc., etc. But he fought against it, and he made a point to fight against the socialists, outlawing it. There's freedom of speech, except if you write that as a socialist, go arrest that guy who runs the newspaper and arrest the guy who said it. And those cats having their meetings of socialism, arrest them and they get sent to jail. We're not asking questions. I'm a dictator now. Cut to your World War II, the same thing happens in Japan, almost for the same reason. So Bismarck was very much an aristocrat, and that he served a king. He needed that. He never grasped for kingship himself. Interesting in world history, but there it is. You cut to Japan in World War II, and they start to see the sort of the same machinations happening in their country as in other countries, i.e. the socialists. And they're very much afraid for the emperor that socialists will come in and upend him, and they're not going to have that. And what you had is that as the root of sort of a militaristic takeover in Japan for the emperor, always for the emperor. And it got very violent. They would, here's a vote that happened. You voted the way they didn't want. 12 Japanese Navy officers ran into your house and killed you and then left. And then the cops come and they're like, who did it? Navy officers. So you look out in town and there's about 1,000 Navy officers in this town. Which ones did it? Well, there's 10 of them showed up. They're all alibiing each other. Yeah, I was playing cards with these 10 guys. And they're all like, yep, we were playing cards. And how can the cops ever find out? And this was happening night after night. Just very violent towards a political opposition. Bismarck, same way before either World War. He saw the threat of socialism and cracked down on it violently, which a lot of other world leaders did not do, to, their detriment. Now, this is all going well until, of course, the old king dies. And this was always going to happen. Now you got a very old Bismarck. The king's son, Wilhelm, I think the second, ends up having medical issues. He had been ousted early on because Bismarck's not going to have any challenges. So he didn't like Bismarck at all, but it didn't matter because by the time he became emperor, he was sick, had some kind of throat cancer, lost the ability to speak, and only was in charge for like 90 days or something like this. Again, the book doesn't cover this much. But we go right from that to that guy's son. Here's where the real problems start. That guy's a young guy. And Bismarck never gets a good grip on him, on his mentality. It's too much the ideal. He's idealistic and doesn't want to hear, because most young people don't, especially young men, want to hear about realism and the way the world works. They just think, y'all did it wrong, I'll do it right. And so he just sort of pushes him out. And this is the king in charge when, your World War I happens, and all the negative then goes after that. But it's you see, just if the handoff could have been a little different, if he would have sort of been able to, if he were friendlier with the father sooner, he could have been sort of the mentor of the son. And then that son could have been sort of raised in his image. And then the handoff to someone who's ready to rule this empire of Germany would have been much smoother versus, hey, I got the sharpest sword, why don't I just start cutting? And he starts cutting, and then, the wheels fall off. He wasn't aware enough of the turmoil of the time. Turmoil of the time being socialists. I mean, it was very heated. I believe Bismarck there was a couple of assassination attempts on Bismarck throughout the decades. Queen Victoria, somebody shot at her. Of course, we know ye old Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was, actually shot, started old WW1. So the people wanted change, and it was bubbling up. But this guy, this Wilhelm III, or I think that's his name, wasn't smart enough to see it. And, that's aftermath, though. That's Bismarck's not in charge anymore. Bismarck, at some point, you can only do what you can do. And in his defense, he held the peace in Europe for 20-something years. And he's owed something for that. But it is interesting to see that he wasn't particularly looked at well when he was ousted. And it's only sort of decades after that when, he goes from 70 to 80-ish, very old man, who, his wife dies very alone. All he has is his beloved trees. He liked trees for some reason. I don't know why, but to each their own. But it was only as he was getting older in age where the people started to come to more of an appreciation for what he did. And of course, the appreciation grew, I think, after your World War I. Now, this isn't all, that's sort of the end of the book, but that's not all I want of Bismarck, clearly. It's too important a figure for just one book. I believe he himself wrote, or like Churchill, dictated. These people like to dictate. He's very good at talking, so let me dictate instead of just with the pen myself. He and Churchill dictated. So, that's interesting. But I think he wrote a book, an autobiography, and I would like to get my hands on this. I haven't yet, so at some point I'm going to read that. This isn't a particularly good history if you're from the sort of the outside looking in to start. This isn't a good one because it's too much interior, not enough of the things that are making the interior move. So if I didn't know all these things already about Austria and Russia, etc., the book doesn't do a good job of explaining it to me. So in that case, I wouldn't start with this book. But if you're sort of well versed, it gives you a lot of good meat. So that was Bismarck, Story of a Fighter. These are your beloved ads. These are my books, and none of them are historically based. They're all completely made up out of my mind. And you can read them via you can buy them. Read them via Kindle Unlimited, which is like Spotify for books. And then you'll have other books at the same time, in case mine suck. You didn't waste your money. Or you can subscribe. You can just watch. We're good anyway. Okay. I will talk to you all next week.